Okay, great. So now I'll introduce our presenter for tonight, Henry Gruber. Henry is a fifth-year PhD student in history with a secondary field in archaeology. His research concerns the material impact of the fall of the Roman Empire in the Iberian Peninsula and is based on the unpublished rescue excavation reports generated by contemporary development in Spain and Portugal. He has spent parts of 8 summers in the field on excavations and is writing a thesis called Shifting Landscapes of Wealth and Power in Late and Post-Roman Iberia. And now I'm going to turn it over to Henry for his talk on Pandemics Past, Accounts of Disease from the Ancient World.
First, let me unmute myself and share my screen. And I just want to take this moment to thank all the organizers. And here I'm going to thank the organizers of this talk, but also just all of the union organizers as well, who have been doing incredible things with our union over the last many years. We've had some really incredible successes, and it feels really good to be a part of it. So thank you to the organizers in the sort of most broadly construed way. So today we're going to be talking about pandemics past. Both here, I think pandemics past is in the pandemics that occurred in the past and the past of pandemics, where we to add an apostrophe. And we're going to be looking at 2 accounts of disease from the ancient Mediterranean world, which are in the texts that I mentioned here and that have been supplied. If you have not had a chance to read the texts, that's totally fine. We're kind of going to go through them in a semi-systematic way, and I'll have quotations up there. And if you have read them, this is an opportunity to look at them again, to think about them. And I really encourage people to take the time to put your own thoughts about these texts into the chat, both discussion questions, just things that they make you think about, because one of the great things about studying the past is that it can serve as a reflection for our own times and our own problems as we think about it. So I've talked about here the ancient Mediterranean world. And what does that mean? It basically is the Mediterranean basin broadly construed. For us right now, it's primarily going to be focusing on a certain Greek intellectual tradition, as seen in our 2 authors, Thucydides and Procopius. And so just for a little overall historical context, the first outbreak of plague that we're looking at occurred in the city-state of Athens, in what's now Greece, what was then sort of Greece, where a place where people spoke a dialect of Greek, in 430 BC. And this took place during a conflict called the Peloponnesian War, which was a big war. I mean, at the time, people thought it was sort of the greatest war of all time, between Athens, the city-state of which Thucydides was a citizen and a general, and their sort of hated enemies, the Spartans. You may remember the Spartans from movies like 300. You may not remember them from movies like 302, Rise of an Empire, which, sort of as an aside, I'll just say I was surprised, having not seen it, that it got a 6.2 out of 10 on IMDb. That's not what I heard. But Athens is the center at this point of an empire, and it is engaged in a large-scale war with its rival. During this war, the plague breaks out, and therefore it is commemorated in a historical text, a historical narrative about the war. Similarly, about 1,000 years later, I think I figured this out as exactly 932 years later, 972 years later, in Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, which was at the time the capital of the Roman Empire, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague. And this is recorded in a large historical work, also about a war, written by the historian Procopius, who is very consciously a historian in the model of Thucydides. And this gives us the opportunity to compare these 2 texts that come of the same intellectual tradition, are written in the same dialect of Greek, and both present us pictures of a certain outbreak of epidemic or pandemic disease and show us a little bit about how their society reacted to it. So we'll start by looking at these two accounts, and I can point you to some other accounts. For issues of time, I haven't gone into them, but I also highly recommend looking at the account of the bubonic plague in 1348 in the introduction to Boccaccio's Decameron. You can find that online. All of these texts, if you haven't gotten the email that has them in them, Google them. They'll show up in sort of public domain translations that are hilariously archaic in certain forms. Okay, the Plague of Athens, context and pathogen. The context is a major war with Sparta, as I've mentioned. This is a war that divided the Greek world, that until then had been somewhat united in its opposition to Persia. Although, of course, all these things are much more complicated than I would want to say now. But this context of the war and the context of the Athenian Empire is really important for thinking about the way that the disease actually plays out, and also the way that Thucydides portrays it for us, because the war is going on, and in the second year of the war, the plague strikes. And so in Thucydides' narrative, we have probably his most famous passage, or second most famous passage, depending how you order that in the plague, is the funeral oration of the Athenian leader Pericles, who gives a very long and extremely complicated, basically the high watermark of my Greek was failing to really read to be able to translate the funeral oration. It's this funeral oration that goes on, and he extols the virtues of the Athenians, the wonderfulness of their empire, how great their democracy is, and it ends, and then I think almost the next sentences, and then the plague came. So this serves as a moment for Thucydides, who's writing later, to think about what went wrong for Athens in this war that they eventually lose. Context and pathogen. Honestly, we're not going to be able to talk too much here about the pathogen because it's still debated what, in fact, the pathogen was. As you can see here, there is either typhoid fever is a probable cause, or there is no proof that typhoid caused the plague of Athens, and these are in the same journal issue. So I don't really know anything about the pathogen, and I'm not going to say anything about that because scientists don't really have any firm belief or firm consensus about what it is. And one thing that we should think about is how much it matters. In the case of the Justinianic pandemic, the second one that we're going to talk about, we really do know what the pathogen is. And so maybe something to think about is, to what extent does this fact, what virus or bacterium causes the disease, how does that affect our reading of the sources, and is it something that we want to think about? Anyway, Thucydides. He is our source, and as in all historical texts, it's really important to try to remember that everyone is writing with an agenda. We often don't know what that agenda is, and we don't know how that agenda impacts sort of the relationship between the text and the reality. But we always have to remember it's there. So Thucydides is a historian who really tries to be a scientific historian, or at least presents himself as trying to do that. He says that he gets everything from things that he either witnessed or conversations he had with people who witnessed them. And when people said different things, he tried to figure out what the right one was. And he's really, sort of at the beginning of a certain positivistic intellectual historical tradition, and has come down in that people talk, read him for foreign policy. People come up with these very, densely edited editions of his text with maps and everything. And he's paired with Herodotus, as he is in this sort of double bust down here, as the fathers of history in the Western intellectual tradition. But of course, he is writing as someone who was a general in a war. He was deeply involved in the politics of his city, and his city went on to lose this war. And so we always have to think about why is he writing this? And that's a question we always want to ask. Why do you write this down? Why would you commemorate a pandemic at all? I was reading something yesterday about how little we commemorate the 1918 flu epidemic in sort of the United States and the world. Well, why is it sometimes that people want to commemorate things and why do people not want to? And so one of the things to think about as we read this is, why is it that Thucydides is writing this? So I'll invite you here at many points to put in the chat why you think someone might write this and why you might think that someone would want to write this. Now, the interesting thing is that Thucydides, in fact, tells us why he's writing it, or at least gives us a reason why he wants to write it. And here I'm just going to say there are going to be a lot of slides that have text on them, which is, for the benefit of those of us who may not, have the reading in front of us or remember all the details. I'm sure everyone did it. So if you don't like slides with text, just sort of let this wash over you. Don't feel like you have to read them. I'm going to pretty much read them out. Now, Thucydides says that all speculation as to its origin, this is about the plague, its origin and its causes, if causes can be found adequate to produce so great a disturbance, I leave to other writers, whether doctors or not. For myself, I shall simply set down its nature and explain the symptoms by which perhaps it may be recognized by the student if it should ever break out again. This I can do very well, as I had the disease myself and watched its operation in the case of others. So one of the really interesting things here is that Thucydides actually tells us that the reason that he's telling us about this plague is so that students, here I think implied medical students, in future generations will be able to recognize the plague if it ever comes back. Which makes it a little ironic that, journal article after journal article for hundreds of years, or scholars for hundreds of years, academic journals for as long as they've existed in the classics, have argued about what disease actually this is. And there's a lot of, reasons that we might not be able to trace it. He might be inexact in his descriptions. The way that it materializes may have changed over time. Pathogens mutate. But this is his goal, that we students today should be able to recognize this disease if it returns. So then he describes the symptoms. And this is a long description of the symptoms that I'm not going to get into sort of in great detail. But you can see how he's very, very an astute observer. Externally, the body was not very hot to the touch, nor pale in its appearance, but reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. But internally, it burned so that the patient could not bear to have on him clothing or linen, even of the very lightest description. So, and this goes on and on and on. But there's a very careful, positivistic description of how the disease materializes in people, what it looks like, and how people react to it. There's also a theme throughout of what I'm going to call medical and religious bafflement, where there is just nothing that people can do to figure out what has happened. So he says, at first the physicians were not of any service, ignorant as they were of the proper way to treat it, and they died themselves the most thickly, as they visited the sick most often. Nor did any human art succeed any better. Supplications in the temples, divinations, and so forth were found equally futile, until the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to them altogether. So there's this sense that whatever people try to do, they just can't, no one can get a sense of it. The doctors don't know, the religious figures don't know. And going on, skipping a little bit ahead, he's talking about the treatments and how they don't really work. He says, some people died in neglect, others in the midst of every attention. No remedy was found that could be used as a specific for what did good in one case, did harm in another. So throughout his account, there's just this sense that this is a new thing that people cannot deal with in any of the sort of systems that they have set up for dealing with things like this. He also talks about visiting the sick as a source of disease, and it raises this question of to what extent do they understand contagion. So he says, on the one hand, if they were afraid to visit each other, this is people who are living in Athens, they perish from neglect. You would want to visit your friends and check on them and make sure that everyone's okay. Indeed, he says, many houses were emptied of their residents for want of a nurse. On the other, if they ventured to make visits, death was the consequence. This was especially the case with such as made any pretensions to goodness. Honor made them unsparing of themselves and their attendants in their friends' houses, where even the members of the family were at last worn out by the moans of the dying and succumbed to the force of the disaster. So there's this definite sense here that there's the people who are going to help the sick they themselves get sick. This, by the way, if you've studied Greek, is a classic men-day construction. Almost everything in Greek is sort of organized around, on the one hand, on the other hand, and it really structures a lot of the way that they think about anything in the world, which is, quite interesting. Anyway, so there's social impacts as well. And this I'm going to call sort of social impact 1. It exacerbates other crises that are going on. And the crisis that's going on is the war. So we see here that an aggravation of the existing calamity was the influx from the countryside into the city due to the Spartan invasion. And the disease was especially felt by the new arrivals. In every war, as we see today, sort of terrible events that are going on in many places around the world, I think Syria, people flee from conflict, and people who flee from conflict are especially at risk in situations of pandemic disease. I think many of us are really worried about what will happen if COVID-19 gets into refugee camps. We're worried about what's happening on our own borders and sort of the horrible conditions there. And there are some really wrenching passages where he talks about the people who have fled from the countryside into Athens and are living in sort of squalid conditions in the heat of the summer, and just how they are devastated by this disease. This here's a picture of refugees in France in 1940. The second thing is there's an impact, and this is social impact 2, sorry. The burial rites are disturbed. All the burial rites before in use were entirely upset, and they buried the bodies as best they could. This is followed with a long description of sort of how terrible this is for burial. And the Greeks are a culture that really takes burial seriously. Those of us who are sort of familiar with the classical tradition and any of its forms think about the battle over heroes' bodies in the Iliad, where you want to take Patroclus' body back, or Priam goes to Achilles begging for the body of his son Hector back so they can bury him. This is a society where burial is extremely, extremely important. And the fact that you can't do traditional burial rites must have just been, excruciating and traumatic. And we get a sense of this. Some years later, there's an Athenian naval victory over the Spartans. And even though they win, a storm comes up and the fleet has to retreat before they can find all of the bodies of the people who've fallen over the ships. And even though the generals won the battle, the Athenian assembly condemns them all because of this sort of religious sacrilege of not bringing the bodies. So the strain on burial practices is again something that we really see in the plague of Athens, and it's something that's deeply traumatic to the society. The last one, social impact 3, is the erosion of norms. He says that men now coolly venture on what they had formerly done in a corner, and not just as they pleased, seeing the rapid transitions produced by persons in prosperity suddenly dying, and those before who had nothing succeeding to their property. So they resolved to spend quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and riches as alike things of a day. Here we see a society that is, quite conservative in many ways. People see what's going on. The religion doesn't do anything. The doctors don't know anything. Rich people are dying. A lot of people go and they have a party. I don't know if they went to the beach for spring break, but they might have, were it there. So these are sort of what we might call social impacts that disease has in a negative way. But we also see social solidarity, and Thucydides is really clear that this comes primarily from people who have recovered from the disease. He says, yet it was with those who had recovered from the disease that the sick and the dying found most compassion. These knew what it was from experience and had now no fear for themselves, for the same man was never attacked twice, never at least fatally. So there's a social solidarity moment where the people who have gone through this disease, because they have some sort of immunity, or at least perceive that they do, go and they are able to begin the process of recovery. And that's something that I think when we think about our own situation more and more, we're seeing that the thought of, should people get ID cards or certificates that say that they have immunities? Are there antibody tests. So this is definitely something that has occurred in the past as well, although they don't have the same sort of means of testing. So at this point, I'll stop with this little picture of Apollo as the archer, the god of plague, and I'll just say, if there's any factual questions about the plague in Athens or Thucydides' description, maybe we can wait for a moment and get those. And then we'll move on and sort of save interpretive discussion and comparison between the two accounts to the end. So I'll wait, see if there's any factual questions.
Yeah, I think while we wait for people to type their questions into the chat, Henry, we had a couple of responses to the question you posed earlier, which was why would someone write a plague account or pandemic account? So Caroline, suggested it might be because, he's looking to tell other people what to expect in the future. Catherine said, because they knew there had been previous plagues, but they didn't know what was done to help the victims. Again, maybe to try to help people in the future. Oh, and then we have a few more questions now. And then I think some people have sort of like longer questions, which I think we might save to the end, if that's okay.
Yeah,
So let's see. I'm just gonna throw in a few questions. If they're too long, we can wait till the end. But Max's question in the chat is, what is the understanding of etiology in ancient Greek medicine? And he's referencing the quote, if causes can be found adequate to produce so great a disturbance, are some diseases classified as uncaused? What could Thucydides mean here? So that's one question.
Okay. So that's a really good question, and it's a question that we debate. There's a lot of debate about the extent to which Thucydides understands sort of Greek medicine, but we have to think that people are probably going to take one of two broad causative theories for disease. One is a sort of miasmatic view that there are sort of vapors or types of air that cause changes in the internal makeup of human bodies and balances between sort of the humors. This is sort of the Hippocratic theory that will cause disease. Now, this is not a Greek example, but I think the best way to think about this, or at least the way that's been most helpful for me, is with malaria. Malaria is a malaria, it's bad air. And, if you go to a swamp and suddenly you get these fevers and stuff, it's quite plausible to think, oh yes, like there's something in this miasma that is causing me to have this reaction. We might say, oh no, it's the mosquitoes that are biting you in the swamp that give you malaria, but that's not, totally obvious. And if you found that you drained the swamp and you got rid of the sort of bad air, people would get better. The other thing would be some sort of divine retribution. I mean, here I have Apollo as the archer. The Iliad, which all of these people would sort of know, better than any of us know any text, unless we're sort of deeply religious and there's a text that we know in that way. Begins with Apollo causing plague to the Greek army outside Troy because they've done various sort of things that offend him religiously. So I think that we can probably think of these two types of causes. One sort of miasmatic, medical, and the other one a sort of religious one.
Great. Maybe we could take the questions suddenly came pouring in. So Henry, maybe we could take one or two more questions, and do you want to proceed?
One
more? Okay. So Bethany had a couple questions, but one is there any archaeological evidence that shows that this plague occurred and how bad it was?
Yeah, again, a really good question. So archaeological evidence for pandemic diseases is very difficult to find, but when we do find it, it can be quite evocative. And until quite recently, there was no archaeological evidence, but about 15, 20 years ago, there were excavations in Athens that did find a mass grave that seems to be from this period. This is where the idea of typhoid, I think, mostly comes from, is that they were able to do various sciencey things, and it suggested that some of the people died of typhoid. So there is mass grave evidence for this. Up until then, some people actually kind of thought the whole thing was made up by Thucydides, that it was a sort of poetic thing that he did, but now we're able to sort of say, no, this really was an event that happened, perhaps not exactly as Thucydides presents it, but it's something where there is mass grave evidence. And that's something we should think about when we look at the Justinian pandemic as well. So I'm going to move on, and I think we'll just have more time for questions at the end, but thank you everyone for submitting them. Okay, bubonic plague in Constantinople, 542 CE. Here we can already see there's a slight difference in that I'm able to say what the disease was. By way of context, in the 6th century of our era, the Roman Empire had fallen. 476 is the deposition of the last Roman emperor in the West. And at the beginning of the reign of this ambitious Emperor Justinian, the sort of dark orange area was the Roman Empire. The new Rome, Constantinople, named after the Emperor Constantine, was the capital, and sort of the most populous, rich, culturally advanced provinces of the empire sort of had survived, while the barbaric, as these people would think, West sort of fell away and had become dominated by various barbarian groups, which we don't have to talk about. Justinian launches a series of quite aggressive and initially quite successful wars and other ventures to reestablish the empire. Some of this stuff is, architectural. He builds the Hagia Sophia, which today still stands in Istanbul. If anyone has been there, it's really worth a visit when we can visit places again. He reforms the laws. He slaughters 30,000 dissident residents of Constantinople in the Hippodrome because they're protesting against him. He launches wars against the sort of Vandal kingdom of Africa, which he conquers, the Goths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain. So there's this moment of sort of reassertion of imperial power. A professor of mine once described it as trying to make the empire great again, which may or may not be apt, depending what you think of Justinian. So at the sort of peak moment of his triumph, the plague hits Constantinople. And in this case, we actually really do know what the pathogen was. It's Yersinia pestis. We've actually been able to sequence the DNA of the pathogen from, at this point, many victims of the plague who have been found in graves. Some of them mass graves, though none huge mass graves, and many actually just sort of strange burials. And Harvard graduate students and postdocs and many student workers have actually done a lot of the really great work on this, associated with a couple organizations, which I just sort of say I'm a part of, the Initiative for the Science of Human Past at Harvard and the Max Planck Harvard Research Center for the Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean. In fact, I know of some people who are maybe on this call who have been actually themselves found plague victims based on their reading of archaeological material, and the genomes have since been sequenced. So what do we know about Yersinia pestis? Yersinia pestis is not primarily a human disease. It's a rodent disease caused, or bubonic plague is a disease caused by Yersinia pestis, which is a rodent pathogen primarily. It lives in infected rodent populations and then passes through fleas to humans. It's a little unclear why at certain moments it has large-scale outbreaks of pandemic scale. It is something that people argue about. This is especially important because actually it has become endemic in the United States. So in the Southwest United States, it's become endemic in the prairie dog population. If you go hiking in New Mexico and you come down with flu-like symptoms, get antibiotics because it might be plague. About 15 to 20 people every year in the United States get it. But there are moments when it leaves the rodent population and goes into humans. And this is most commonly associated with rats. There's the Emperor Justinian. He got the plague, actually. And that's an interesting feature because Roman emperors are kind of supposed to be invincible. But Cécile Morisson, a sort of French scholar, she has found perhaps coins that depict the emperor as ill, which would be very interesting if that is true, but they're sort of hard to tell because they're little coins. So the rat. The black rat, Rattus rattus, is mainly considered to be the vector of plague based on studies that were done in India in the early 20th century, and also sort of what we think we know about the great pandemic of the Middle Ages, which was also caused by Yersinia pestis, the Black Death, bubonic plague. But I'll say we don't actually know a ton about the way that the disease sort of travels, or rather, many of the things that we thought we knew are probably still true, but maybe not the only thing that's true. So I recently read an article that has posited that, in fact, the reservoir for the plague in the High Middle Ages was not the rat population, but the reservoir was the alpine gerbil population. Although if you look online at various memes about the Black Death, it seems that people pretty much still are going with the rat theory, at least in the meme world. So all of this plays into sort of a broader question about that's been quite controversial, the age of pandemics and Rome's fall, because the bubonic plague pandemic is the best documented sort of late Roman pandemic that we have, but it's not the only one. And Harvard PhD graduate Kyle Harper has come out with a book recently, The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of the Empire, which sort of puts a maximum position on nature did it. So one of the things we want to think about is the relationship here between the empire and natural causes of its demise, as it were, although not natural causes in sort of a nice way that we think about. In this sense, we think about the fact that the Roman Empire is stitched together by networks of communication by ship. Rats like to travel on ships because ships have grain. Therefore, as we see in our sources, the disease can spread very quickly throughout the empire and devastate a lot of the sort of urban communities that are quite Roman. There's been a lot of pushback on this. I'll just point you to the bibliography attached, where there's just been, I'll just say there's a lot of debate right now about the question of whether nature did it. That's not our question today. We're instead going to turn to Procopius. Procopius is a 6th century historian. He was alive during the events that he wrote about. He was the personal secretary to the great general of Justinian, who was sort of his generalissimo in most of the wars that he fought. And Procopius writes a multi-volume history of the wars of Justinian, where he sort of talks about all the triumphs that he had militarily, also including sort of setbacks like the plague. He also wrote this book called The Buildings. I should note this is not a manuscript page of Procopius, but it is a 6th century manuscript page written in Greek, so it can give us some sort of sense. But he also wrote this book called The Secret History. And I guess in the difference between, the 70s edition and the new edition, Penguin Classics has decided to take the Empress Theodora off the cover and put Justinian instead. But this is an extremely negative account of the emperor. It was published posthumously. Justinian is a demon. Theodora is a horrible dancer. Who he finds in a dance hall. She has no morals. There's orgies. It's like everything is terrible, and the emperor is horrible. And we always kind of have to read the triumphant public histories of Justinian written by Procopius with the knowledge that he was also kind of secretly working on this book that just trashed everybody, even though it was not published. So that's something we want to think about as we read this text. And I'll turn to this text now to look at it. So the outbreak. During these times, there was a pestilence by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated. That's how he starts it. It seems pretty serious, and it kind of builds from there. He talks about the symptoms, again, like Thucydides, who is really, and this is important to remember, he's read Thucydides, he loves Thucydides. If we had any sense of, his own mental states, he wants to be the Thucydides for his own age. And so he talks about the symptoms. He says it was natural, therefore, he says, so the fever actually doesn't start out that badly. It was natural, therefore, that not one of those who had contracted the disease expected to die from it. But on the same day in some cases, and on others in the following day, and the rest not many days later, a bubonic swelling developed, and this took place not only in the particular part of the body, which is called bubon, that is below the abdomen, this is the groin, but also inside the armpit, and in some cases could also inside the ears and a different point on the thighs. This is the sort of typical black swelling that you get from a flea bite case of bubonic plague, where sort of it's nasty. It's a nasty way to die, but you get these sort of hard black swellings, which are very, very paradigmatic of the disease. Again, he talks about medical bafflement. So it was that in this disease there was no cause which came within the province of human reasoning, for in all cases the issue tended to be something unaccountable. For example, while some were helped by going to the baths, others were harmed in no less degree. And of those who received no care, many died, but others, contrary to reason, were saved. And again, methods of treatment show different results with different patients. Indeed, the whole matter may be stated thus, that no device was discovered by man to save himself, so that either by taking precautions he should not suffer, or that when the malady had assailed him, he should get the better of it. But suffering came without warning, and recovery was due to no external cause. So again, like in Thucydides, we have a society that can't really figure out how to deal with this, given the medical sort of treatments of their day. Burial practices. Again, at that time, all the customary rites of burial were overlooked. This is no longer the sort of Greek pagan, although it's a loaded term, society of Thucydides, but it's a Christian society. But again, in Christianity, burial is extremely important. For all manner of reasons, sort of theological, but also just sort of social. Burial is very important, and so this is a highly traumatic event again for the society that all the customary rites of burial are overlooked. And if you turn to this section in the text, there's just these really kind of heartbreaking descriptions of what people do. They're just overwhelmed with what to do. The emperor says, it's like the one place the emperor really does stuff. Tries to count the bodies. They give up at 230,000 in a city of probably about 600,000. So it's really a disaster for these social norms. But there is social solidarity. And here, while it's not about the people who've recovered, here it's organization. So it says at that time, too, those of the population who had formerly been members of the circus factions, there are chariot racing teams in Constantinople this period. The fans hate each other. They kill each other fairly regularly in sort of riots. But the circus factions laid aside their mutual enmity, and in common they attended to the burial rites of the dead. And they carried with their own hands the bodies of those who were no connections of theirs and buried them. And while Thucydides sort of talks about the bad behavior that people do, here we see good behavior caused by it, and then bad behavior. So nay, and again, apologies for the blocks of text. Roll with it if you have to. Those who in times past used to take delight in devoting themselves to pursuits both shameful and base shook off the unrighteousness of their daily lives and practiced the duties of religion with diligence. But as soon as they were rid of the disease and were saved, and already supposed that they were in security since the curse had moved on to other peoples, then they turned sharply about and reverted once more to their basest of hearts. And now, more than before, they make a display of the inconsistency of their conduct, altogether surpassing themselves in villainy and in lawlessness of every sort. For one could insist emphatically, without falsehood, that this disease, whether by chance or by some providence, chose out with exactitude the worst men and let them go free. And the last thing we'll talk about a difference is that he actually does not link visiting the sick in any way with getting sick. He says those who were attending them, that is attending the sick, were in a state of constant exhaustion and had a most difficult time of it throughout. For this reason, everybody pitied them no less than the sufferers, not because they were threatened by the pestilence and going near it, for neither physicians nor other persons were found to contract this malady through contact with the sick or with the dead, for many who were constantly engaged either in burying or in attending those in no way connected with them, held out in the performance of the service beyond all expectation. While many others, the disease came on without warning and they died straight away. This is interesting to think about just in terms of Procopius's description of the disease and what we know about the way that the bubonic plague is transferred. It's actually very rarely transferred between humans. For the most part, you have to be bitten by an infected flea in something like 95% of cases. So you could imagine a world in which someone became sick and they were bathed and their family was taking care of them, and doctors came and there were actually no infected fleas, but someone who had holed themselves up in their house, and not seen anybody, infected rats came in and got them. They became sick through that. So this is actually quite insightful on Procopius's part, and it's quite different from what Thucydides tells us. And that kind of raises this final question, which is how much is Procopius just copying Thucydides? There's a school of thought that sort of, I'm going to sort of knowingly caricature them right now in the same way that I sort of caricatured Kyle Harper as saying, nature did it. He has a more nuanced argument. These people have a more nuanced argument. That Procopius kind of invents, or doesn't invent it, but wants to be Thucydidean in this way. That he is writing a large multi-volume history of the wars of his time that are the greatest events that have ever happened. And in Thucydides' book 2, you have a giant plague outbreak that changes the course of history. Well, he's going to have a giant plague outbreak in book 2 that's going to change the course of history. And, you can point to moments like here where it really looks like Procopius is copying Thucydides to get some sense of that. Thucydides says, all speculation to its origin and causes, he leaves to other writers, whether lay or professional. For himself, he shall simply set down its nature. And Procopius says, now let each one, whether philosopher or astrologer, express his own judgment concerning the matter. But as for me, I shall proceed to tell where this disease, blah, 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 blah. So there are moments in Procopius where he really, and this is not the only one, where he really sort of mimics the language of Thucydides, who he's already sort of writing in the mode of. And it raises this question, which is an important question, which is how seriously do we take this account, given how dependent it is on Thucydides. And a lot of this debate is taking place sort of as we speak. Publications are coming out all the time, looking at, yes, we have plague pits with people in them, but if you have a plague pit with 7 people in it somewhere, is that really looking like what we expect to see with this sort of world-ending pandemic? But I'll just sort of render no judgment on this and just say that I think what we see here at a minimum is that Procopius is looking back for other examples of when has something like this happened before. And of course, he finds in his intellectual idol, in his historical model, Thucydides, a parallel event. And in the same way that we today are looking at the past, whether these pandemic outbreaks or the bubonic plague of the 14th century, or the sort of great dying that occurred in the Western Hemisphere with the combination of pandemic disease and sort of brutal oppression that destroyed a lot of indigenous populations, or the 1918 pandemic, we ourselves look to the past as well, and interpreting things through with a historical consciousness does not mean that things today or in the present are not happening. So this is something for us to think about. That's sort of all I've got prepared as introductory material. And at this point, I just sort of want to open it up for questions and see. I've been seeing pings as questions come in, although I've not been able to read them. And questions or comments.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks Henry for the great presentation. Thanks everyone for submitting your questions throughout the talk. We have actually about 12 or 15. Some of them are pretty meaty questions. I think Henry is okay with staying beyond the hour to answer them. So yeah, if anyone else has any other questions to submit or comments to make, please do so in the chat. And yeah, we'll just go through the list. So Bethany had a question from a while back. We've known for a long time that war is a real breeding ground for disease. Did the ancient Greeks know that as well? Did Thucydides anticipate some kind of disease outbreak?
Okay, so there's a question in there that I think I can answer, and there's a question that I don't think I can answer. The question that I can't answer is whether Thucydides anticipated this. I am not a Thucydides scholar, but I think that even Thucydides scholars would have a hard time, pinning an anticipation on him. The question of do they associate war with disease is something that is, a very good question. I think the answer is a cautious yes. As I sort of mentioned earlier, the Iliad, the sort of great epic of war in the Greek world, begins with an outbreak of some sort of pandemic disease. Not pandemic, some outbreak of disease in the Greek camp, in this case caused by Apollo. And there's a very nice quote. I actually have it up on the next slide, so I'll put it up because it's probably my favorite quote from the extant Greek corpus, which is that Thucydides talks about what people talk about in this thing. And he says that among the other things which they remembered was the following verse. And this is a prophetic verse, which the old men said long ago had been uttered: "A Dorian war shall come, and with it death." The Spartans are sort of related to the Dorians in ways. And a dispute arose as to whether dearth, this is a translation here, but limos is the Greek word famine, and not death, loimos or plague. So the translator found a good pun in English that works as well, is the message here. And basically Thucydides thinks people would fit the prophecy to work with whatever their current situation was. But there's very clear that in this prophecy, there is some sense that there's a connection between war and disease. So I think that we can think that the Greeks would have thought that, although we can't say exactly what they would have, what the cause of it would have been. Is it sort of war is, an unjust war or unjust acts during war lead to pandemic disease, or some other thing? Importantly here, there's a huge outbreak of smallpox in the Roman world. We think it's smallpox in the 160s, sort of first of the great pandemics that Kyle Harper talks about. And the Romans really think that the army brings it back from Persia, from what's now Iraq, because they sack a temple, and they desecrate this temple, and the god is upset and sends them back to the Roman Empire with a disease. So there is an association sort of with war and disease in this Greco-Roman tradition.
Great. Yeah, a few more excellent questions submitted. Just going down the list. So Jonas had sort of two questions. What sort of divine punishment was read into the plague in antiquity? And how did the spread of pathogens undermine social hierarchies beyond the war?
Good questions. Very big and important questions. I'll say that what I can do right now is only a very brief overview of what, there's been a lot of really good scholarship on this. The Justinianic pandemic has been linked by many people to a rise in sort of Christian apocalypticism. People really think that the world is coming to an end. At least some people do. There's a series of very moving sermons from probably 7th century Spain, although the dating is a little unclear, that are almost like sample sermons that like you can kind of use when you need them, and they're about the plague approaching, and it's a series of 4 sermons, like we've heard that the next town over has the plague, and it's all like repent, and it's as each day the plague is coming closer. You know, maybe if we all repent, we can turn it away. And by the last day, they're basically saying, well, we must have really done something bad, but like, why should we really be upset about this? Because it looks like we deserve it, and we're all going to probably end up going to heaven anyway, as long as we die in church. And so there's definitely in that period quite a quite an association with punishment. The question of social hierarchies is also really interesting. In the Justinianic pandemic, you have legislation complaining about sort of the workers are asking for a lot more money than they're supposed to get. Everyone knows this is supposed to cost this much money, but you know they're asking for 3 times as much, and then that's bad. And there's also just very practical things that happen in the early wars of Justinian. His armies number many thousands of people. You know, Romans kind of have large armies. After the plague, you're looking at like 3,000 guys getting sent somewhere to like reconquer it. There's a manpower shortage because of this. There's a sort of a prolonged demographic crisis. If you're sort of a catastrophist who thinks that this destroyed the ancient Mediterranean world, you look at this as the moment when a sort of urban civilization became fundamentally ruralized, and it's the beginning of the Middle Ages. In Athens, there's also a huge impact. The leader of Athens, Pericles, dies in the plague, and there are political repercussions that sort of go deep into the society. And in that point, there's some stuff in the bibliography there.
Great, thanks, Henry. And another question, somewhat related to divine punishment. Did superstition, from Sonia, did superstition increase or modify somehow through the course of the disease?
I'm just gonna say I think that depends, like what we mean by superstition. There are certain religious practices in both societies that take off. There's a lot of work that's been done on sort of the impact or not of this disease on the cult of saints. I know that there's some work that's currently going on right now that has not yet been published, looking at the relationship between healing cults and the cult of saints and doctors in late antiquity, sort of this Justinian period. And is this actually something that leads to a lack of faith in doctors? So, I mean, superstition is, for us, I think, as for the Romans, a loaded and negative term. But I will say that there is evidence for unorthodox religious practice that happens in probably both of these cases.
Great. Question from Belle. Are there other accounts of these outbreaks that we can compare these accounts to?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. In the case of Thucydides, basically no. Thucydides is kind of the only person who talks about this, although Thucydides is the only person who talks about a lot of the things that happen in this period. One of the things that we have to remember when we look at the ancient world is not a lot survives. I think we have, of the books that we know the title of, we have parts of only about 5%. So there's a huge amount of material that's been lost. But in that extant material, Thucydides is really all we got. If you look at the bibliography, there's a note in there. It's like a 1-page article saying that like maybe there's an allusion to the plague of Athens in a Greek play. But that's kind of the nature of what we're looking at. For the Justinianic pandemic, the source space is much better. Orders of magnitude better, although still not great. There's one other long account by a John of Ephesus, who's a Christian religious figure, and he writes a very intense, long, moving account of his journey traveling through an area, kind of following the plague and seeing the devastation that it's caused, villages totally abandoned, places where there's just, everyone in the village has died and there's no one to bury the dead, mixed in with sort of like moral things where people come to a village, they come to a village, they decide they're going to steal the stuff from the village because everyone's dead. Well, of course, they then die and you should steal. But it's hard to know whether this is sort of enough. And this gets at this question of how bad was the Justinianic pandemic? Did it cause the sort of end of antiquity? In the area where I study, it's now Spain and Portugal, there's one sentence, which is from a chronicle, and it just says, in this year, the groin disease, the plaga inguinalis, ground down almost all of his body. On the one hand, you might say, well, that sounds really bad. On the other hand, you might say, oh, it's just like one sentence. It couldn't have been that bad. But this is a chronicle where things like the death of kings and portents in the heavens and stuff also only get one sentence. So it's quite hard to judge. But there is a huge project going on based at Harvard, where many grad students and undergraduate students as well are working with professors, but it's, the student workers are doing this to collect every single mention of the Justinianic pandemic in Latin, Greek, Arabic, Old Persian, Hebrew, and sort of just any language that someone knows.
That's incredible. Great. So the next question we have is, I think, referring to the Thucydides account. Do we know what kinds, from Susanna, do we know what kinds of coordinated responses the city-state took in response to the plague? From Thucydides' account, that account seems to focus on interactions between individuals and doctors rather than the city-state.
Yes. So this is, I will say that we do not know. This is our only account. But from the account that we have, it really seems like there was no response by the government. And that's just something that we have to think about, that this is not a state that's set up, at least as far as Thucydides presents it, to deal with a crisis like this. Whatever is going on is done sort of on the individual level, or at best the family level, and there's no coordinated response.
And then a comment came in from Sophie in response to your first question of, why would he write this in the first place? Maybe people recorded these events for Kleos, K-L-E-O-S, which...
Yes. Kleos is sort of the Greek word for sort of fame. Like you go, Achilles dies on the beaches of Troy rather than live a long life so that he can have eternal Kleos. So definitely Thucydides wants the events that he is recording to live forever because they are the greatest. He kind of has this incredible thing where he says, like, you may think that there were things in the past, like I think he's thinking of Homer, that were like bigger than this, but like if we actually think about it, none of that stuff probably really happened. At least on the scale that it is. But like we know that this war was the greatest event that ever happened in human history, and therefore we want to remember it so that people don't forget about it. And so yeah, Kleos is a huge thing for these societies.
Great question from Emma. Has there been any DNA sequencing of victim remains? I know they've used this in plague victims to try and ID the pathogen, but maybe in the Black Plague victims, but maybe the remains for the counts you described are way too old.
There are I'm going to say here, so there's DNA work done on the pathogen, and DNA work is also on the people. The DNA work on the people, there's a ton of ancient DNA work that's going on for the late antique world. A lot of it gets a little tied up in these questions of sort of ethnicity, but there is DNA work going on there. There's been a ton of DNA work on the pathogen. So if the question is about, the answer to both is yes. But the work on the pathogen has been really exciting. In as much as we've been able to sequence the entire genome, I say we very loosely here, sort of the scholarly community has been able to sequence the genome of the plague bacillus and actually create a phylogenetic tree so we can start to trace the path that different outbreaks took through the Mediterranean world and the relationship between sort of the pathogens, the specific bacteria that cause certain outbreaks with others. So we can say like, oh, this grave that's archaeologically or carbon dated to what seems like the first outbreak seems like is a predecessor of this one that seems to be about 30 years later, and we can start to trace the path that these things took, because the Justinianic pandemic stuck around for a while. There's something like, depending how you count, 18 to 35 different outbreaks over the next couple centuries.
All right, returning back to Thucydides, Justina has a question. Do we know what people Thucydides is referring to when he mentions men? Is he referring to people generally, as in mankind, men in general, or to men of a certain social class?
That's a really good question, and my impression is, although I am not a philologist or anything, that the word for men that he's using is probably sort of means all people, and that which is, the Greek world is an extremely hierarchized, patriarchal, class-based world, but there's and there are very specific words to differentiate between social classes: citizen, non-citizen, these sort of half-citizen medics, and also men and women. But I think here he's and I would have to go back and look at the Greek and the specific passages, but probably most of the time here it sort of just stands in for human.
So just so you know, we have maybe a dozen questions left. So you have a sense of you're here all night. Okay, great. Okay. So a question from Margaret: how come the plague was never mentioned in Greek history books?
I think that this is going to maybe get me in trouble. I think that there's a feeling that many people have, especially people who want to talk about sort of history in a broad scale, that we want to have a history that has human agents. And people get very uncomfortable when talking about non-human agency. And the idea that you could have something like a pandemic disease that takes away human agency is not something that we necessarily want to put into high school history textbooks or something like that. Sort of, actually, I'll just say the only time people do seem to want to do that is when it's something like, oh, smallpox, killed all the Aztecs and it wasn't the Spanish's fault. You can kind of take away the human agency to excuse things that are otherwise problematic to your narrative. But I think that there is a sense that people want to talk about, if you're going to talk about the war between Athens and Sparta, you want to talk about democracy versus oligarchy. You don't want to talk about some sort of pandemic disease thing. And I think in the stuff around the fall of the Roman Empire and the Justinianic pandemic, there's also a sense of, we want to have this be a human process, not something that's sort of external and comes in like that. But those answers will probably be controversial and get you in trouble.
Great, thank you. Catherine had a comment, I think, just when you were transitioning to talking about the second pandemic, 200 years of the pandemic. That's incredibly long for society to deal with an infectious disease like this. And then Hannah had a question. What are the earliest Procopius manuscripts?
Okay, so this is actually, so the first one that I'll say is yes. The first, there's the last sort of recorded outbreak of what we think of as this pandemic is, I believe, from Baghdad in about 750, although don't quote me on that. The back of Kyle Harper's book, or Stathopoulos' 2004 book, which is in the bibliography, has the list. But 750 or so, so about 200 years later, is kind of generally considered to be the end of this wave of the Justinianic pandemic of bubonic plague. What seems to happen, although this is extremely controversial, is what people call waves or amplification effects, where for reasons that we're not entirely sure, perhaps due to rodent populations, perhaps due to human populations, new people being born who don't have acquired immunity, you know, every 10 or 15 years, there seems to be new outbreaks of this disease. In the Arab world, certain of these outbreaks are called the plagues of the maidens. I don't read Arabic, but this is what people have told me, which suggests that they're really hitting the young population, people who do not have acquired immunity to this. So yeah, I mean, the people who tend to think that this caused the end of the Roman Empire or the end of the ancient world, you know, it's not just because it's this one thing that happened in 542, 543, but it keeps coming back. I mean, we have definite accounts of an outbreak in Marseille in the 580s, in Rome in the late 580s, and there are lots of these things. So yeah, it's a huge disease burden on these populations, although we have to imagine that it was most devastating first. As for the earliest manuscripts of Procopius, this is like wildly embarrassing, but I don't know that off the top of my head. And I hope my advisor doesn't finish this.
Great. Thanks, Henry. Sonia had another question. Oh, no, we had that one already. Emma had a question. Is there any writing on whether there was an increase or decrease in medicine or science of the time, since it was so ineffective in addressing the disease?
So as I said, there's actually, I know someone who's right now working on what seems to be a very interesting article that will hopefully come out at some point about the way that Greek medicine of the 6th century CE reacts to this pandemic. And it seems complicated. It seems like they actually start to figure some stuff out. But there are also people who really think that the failure of doctors to be able to deal with this leads a lot to certain things like the rise of certain healing saints. And so it's a complicated question, and we don't really, I don't really have a good answer, but I'm looking forward to reading this article when it comes out, hopefully later this year or next year.
Great. Ayush had a question, part of which was answered previously. Do these texts or others also include details on what we might call today policy responses? So we know Thucydides did not really talk about that. What about Procopius?
Procopius does at one point sort of talk about a policy response. The emperor does two things primarily. The first one is he hires somebody, pays his sort of, he's got this referendarius, who's sort of a high official, to be in charge of burial and to organize the burial of people, because they have run out of all the traditional burial grounds. There's just nothing to do. What they end up doing, and we have not found this archaeologically, so some people sort of suspect it, is that they just stack bodies up inside the towers of the city walls and then collapse the roof down on top of it. and bury people like that. And the emperor also pays people to count the bodies, but they give up in despair at 230,000, which is probably about a half to a third of the population of the city at that time. Constantinople was a huge city in this period. But that's about it. There's a law of Justinian sort of being like, it's very vague, but he's like, okay, we've heard there's something really bad that's happening, and like we're going to kind of try to do our best about it. And then there's various laws about wages and stuff like
Sorry. Great. Another question from Sonia. Did people's value of death and life change through the disease?
This value of death and life changed through disease. Now, in the 14th century plague and its aftermath, there's a huge culture of sort of a like memento mori and the dance of death, and you get all of these sort of really kind of creepy, you know, like Grateful Dead-esque skeletons dancing with flowers around. You don't really see that in the 6th century. I mean, we don't really have as much art that survives. Again, there's this question of sort of the various cults of saints, but that's a really good question, and one that is a little hard to get a hold of. I would point again to these plague sermons from Spain, where the guy is sort of trying to say like, okay, look, we might all die. Like some of us already have the buboes on us. Like, but you know, look, we've all been good Christians, and clearly there must be a reason for this. We're going to go to heaven. In the case of Athens, there are certain incidents that suggest that there are changes going on in society that may or may not be linked to this plague. One of the famous incidents of sort of a few years after, 15 years after, so it's hard to know how tight you can tie it, is that aristocratic Greeks, including the sort of playboy of Athens, Alcibiades, are performing the sacred mysteries, whatever those are, you know, maybe who knows what they are, people have theories, in their privacy of their own homes, and there's a sense of sort of these things that were like traditional religious rites, well, clearly they're not traditional religious rites, why can't we just like do this in our household? A lot of people, Carl Ruck as a classicist, thinks that these sacred rites that they're doing were in fact some sort of intoxicant, and that these could, you know, people don't care anymore about the religious content, you could just, you know, eat whatever it is advertised to eat in your house. And Alcibiades gets exiled.
Thank you. So the next question from Caroline is kind of the flip side of a couple questions we previously had. Did people, in fact, look to their government for answers in the same ways we do now?
Look at them. There's a sense, I think, that you can pick up from Procopius that people wanted the emperor to do something. And that's why there's this sort of public, like he's very political. The emperor did this, the emperor did this. But he also talks about how the governments are, there's a very evocative line where no one is able to be found in all of Constantinople wearing their official regalia, which people don't ever really into. Like if you were an official, you like loved the special, you know, brooch that you could wear. You had this like, oh, I'm like this official, I get my own special colored belt, but no one is wearing that. So there's a sort of governmental collapse. I don't know if that has to do with people looking to it. The one other case we could look at is in the Western Mediterranean, people look to their bishops, or at least the bishops like to say that people look to them. And the great historian of late 6th century bishops in Gaul, Gregory of Tours, loves to tell stories about how like this bishop led his people in this procession around the city and like the plague didn't come. And this bishop was bad and he left the city to flee, but like he got the plague. And so there's like and of course, episcopal politics in Gaul influenced Gregory in ways that like we're not, we're still figuring out. But Gregory actually seems to think that, it seems to suggest, of course, he himself is a bishop, that people look to their bishops in these times for guidance. Bishops, I should say, being the main civil authority in post-Roman Gaul. It's now France. There is no government there.
Thanks. So the next question comes from the Libyan-American Alliance. Thanks for joining us. And Henry, you touched on this a bit already, but is there any evidence of permanent change of religious or cultural rituals because of the pandemic? If there's anything you want to add there?
Yeah. So now that I've sort of brought up Gregory's tour, one thing that people have I know been working on, I know friends who've worked on this sort of much more than I have, is the institution of various Christian rituals, including what are called rogations, where the whole community comes together and sort of marches around in a perimeter. Those seem to really start, although not, it's not totally, first of all, I'm not a scholar of Christian ritual, and so there are different types of rogations. There's some that are ordinary, there's some that are extraordinary, not my thing. But it seems like reading Gregory that there are some of these rituals that start with the plague, or at least come into focus due to the plague in ways that he wants to present that way. And there are other cults. Some people have linked really the rise of the cult of Mary as the protector of Constantinople with the plague, combination of the plague and the Avar siege of 626. So there are various linkages with this. The question of its impact on the sort of pre-Islamic world of the Arabian Peninsula is also a really important and really interesting one, because this is the world into which the Prophet Muhammad is born, and there are sort of definite strains of apocalypticism and eschatological thought that come out of all of the Abrahamic religions in this period, that many people have linked to sort of the plague and its aftermath.
Wow, great. Question from Maria: was Constantinople still seriously divided by the Nicaea riots around the time of the plague? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been. So the Nika riots, I sort of alluded to this. There's a huge riot against the tax policies of Justinian, although, again, these things are very complicated and we don't entirely know the details and sort of what happened. But the crowd in the hippodrome, so where they do the chariot races, and you have to remember, in the late Roman world, it's very rare to see the emperor. The only time you really see the emperor is at very formal occasions, which include the chariot races. And in the chariot races, the crowd in the hippodrome can like organize chants, and if everyone is chanting different things, like probably the emperor can't hear it. But if you can get all the like tens of thousands, 100,000 people who can fit into the chariot racing thing to chant the same thing, the emperor notices. And there's a chant that they should get rid of this guy John the Cappadocian, who's like a finance minister and is like good at collecting taxes in a way that people don't like. And it leads to this huge riot. And this is actually a moment in which the chariot circus factions seem to come together. And there's a really brutal crackdown. There's a great moment actually about the Justinian's wife, the Empress Theodora, who Justinian wants to flee the city. This is early in his rule. There's this huge mob of people, and his whole thing is like, well, why don't we flee the city? Maybe we can raise troops somewhere else, and we can come back and do this whole thing. And his wife says to him, according to it, that purple is a very nice color for a shroud. The imperial robes are purple. And the idea is that she would rather die as the empress, being killed by this mob, than leave the city. And after he says that, she says that to him. Justinian sort of is like, okay, well, you gotta stay here. And raises some troops in the city, the palace guards, this general Belisarius, and they slaughter the people in the hippodrome, kill something like 30,000 people. And that's about 10 years before the plague hits. So we have to think that people still remembered that, definitely. And it was also a time of sort of social solidarity of the people of Constantinople. John the Cappadocian, by the way, loses his job. Maybe his life, I forget.
Okay, thanks, Henry. So now we're down to our last handful of questions. If anyone has any burning questions left, please type them into the chat. So we do have a comment left by Lauren, who's saying, it's very interesting to hear a different perspective. I'm a scientist by training, and Thucydides' account resonated more with me, giving what sounds like just facts of the illness. With Procopius' account, this one seems a lot more fake, with him mostly just judging everyone and really trying to stamp what was going on with his opinion of the situation. Granted, I do not have a history in the other texts at the time, but why would you think that Thucydides is making it up? Also, both accounts seem like reports of different illnesses from a scientific perspective. The different specific details, such as the first being contagious and the second one not, do not make it seem like Procopius copied Thucydides.
So I just want to say I think that is like a very astute comment. I think it's right in many ways. Thucydides, I think that the differences in the description of the symptoms really show that they are independent sources, and that Procopius is not copying Thucydides, especially now that we know, because of the ancient DNA, that it is Yersinia pestis. Again, I am neither a doctor nor like a real specialist in the ancient Greek language, but I have friends who are specialists in ancient Greek medicine and have really studied Procopius's description closely and say that it is really an accurate description of what happens in bubonic plague in the individual. So I think that that's really right. As to the question of why people think that Thucydides made it up, just because it doesn't seem to fit with any specific disease that we know of. There's no, like, people have just argued back and forth. Another reason is that no other sources really mention it. Also, like, over the course of the history of scholarship, you can pretty much find someone who says anything. That's like a little trivializing. But there's an article that I'll point to in the bibliography about Thucydides. Is it poetry or is it history? I forget that. But people have sort of raised this question before.
Great. So Emma had another question. How much did the ruling class know about previous plagues? I guess this is a question for the time of the Procopius account. Was Thucydides fairly niche or widely read?
Thucydides is widely read. I mean, this society with a very low rate of literacy, but as these things go, Thucydides is a canonical text, especially for someone who's sort of Procopius's type. I mean, I don't think that everyone who had a library would necessarily have Thucydides in it. There are other things that are more, probably more common, but it's not a niche, necessarily niche. It's not a niche text. And people also knew about sort of Roman pandemics. I mean, there are these earlier Roman diseases that I think people would have sort of known about in some sense. But honestly, it's a really good question. And Procopius sort of says that nothing like this has ever happened before. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question to think about sort of what people in the past would have known about their own past. And it's one that I don't. There are also biblical plagues. I mean, and this is another thing that by the time you get to Procopius, you're dealing with a fundamentally Christian culture, although the question of sort of Procopius' own religious views is its own thing. And people would have thought about, their own religious traditions and their own plagues, in the Hebrew Bible, but also in patristic writers. So these plague sermons from Spain talk about an outbreak that we don't really know anything about. supposedly during the lifetime of Augustine. Augustine of Hippo writes about some outbreak that actually ends up not happening because the people of Constantinople sort of repent well enough. So there's definitely a sense that these sort of big outbreaks of disease have happened.
Great. So we're coming to maybe what might be our final question from Camille. So Camille, sorry not to put you on the spot, do you want to ask it, or shall I?
Sure. I'm happy to read it out, yeah. My question is, do we know whether there was the same sort of perceived tension between science or reason and religion or spirituality at either of these times that is common now, or considered common now? When we talk about medical and religious bafflement, do we know whether the same people were looking to both for explanation, or whether there was some sort of split in which individuals or groups prioritized one over the other? And last, did the bafflement of the plague undermine one way of knowing over the other? Do we know anything about that?
Great question, and those are questions where we kind of have to read between the lines of the text. I think that we can really see it. I mean, I think that, in this thing where we have here, in both of these cases where, I leave it to other people, whether lay or professional. Now let each one, whether philosopher or astrologer, which I think is just a great combination of people who you're going to have here. These sort of form parts of a dialogue that has to, it reflects a dialogue that's going on in these societies, which to me, I mean, seem to be quite, there is this thing going on. And I actually want to pull up really quickly, if I can find it, a line from the Procopius. I don't have it in front of me because I have my PowerPoint up, so I'll see if I get it on my phone. But there's a thing in which he says, Procopius kind of talks about the people who go around, and I'll paraphrase this because I can't find it, who just want to convince people that their sort of system is right no matter what the truth is, and they think that they're a success if they can just, convince some people based on this sort of these causes that they've made up. And I really think this gives us an insight into these world where you have people who are kind of going around and being like, oh, I actually know, I can explain this. Like, and they'll try to explain it. And someone like Procopius, who's, a smart guy, and somewhat skeptical. I mean, he's the guy who wrote The Secret History, trashing the reign of Justinian, which, whether you agree with it or not, shows that he's not someone who sort of buys the standard line, is just saying, like, these people have no idea. And so I think we can really read that into his account.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Henry. I think that's the end of our list of really great questions. Thanks for taking time to answer each one of them so thoroughly. Yeah, and thanks to everyone who's still on an hour and a half into this talk. Seems like that's the real amount of time these talks seem to be taking. So we have recorded this talk. We're going to be sending out a link to everyone who's registered for the series. And thanks so much to Henry for the wonderful presentation, and to everyone for engaging so much with the text and the presentation. Your questions were really great. Is there, before we wrap up, is there anything anyone else wants to say? No? Okay, great.
I'll just say thank you, everyone, for the incredible questions. I mean, these are texts that we read, some of us read over and over again, and every time we encounter new people reading them, they bring up new questions that we've never thought about. And it's sort of incredible to see people from different scholarly backgrounds, people without scholarly background, come together, and together we can, really use these, I think, to try to figure out both what they say about the past and what they say about the present.
Great. Okay, so this was the second talk in our COVID Night School series. Next week, we're back with with science. Matt Volpe, PhD student in the chemistry department, is going to be presenting on drugs to treat the biochemistry of drugs to treat COVID-19. So we hope you'll be able to join us next week and the week after, and we're lining up more talks after that. So please stay tuned.